Today, he's working as an independent consultant, and he supports clients to develop systems for monitoring and evaluating research impact, policy influence, and advocacy. Welcome, Simon, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just pull up my slides. Perfect. So you should see my opening slide there. Thank you very much, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you, Guillaume and Mireille, for the invitation to this fantastic conference. What a great event you've put on for us. Thank you for your hard work. So outcome mapping is what I will talk about, as Lisa mentioned. I'm going to talk you through some of the underlying concepts, the foundations, and I'll show you how it all comes together in the methodology and the tools. We usually do these kinds of introductions in a longer time, so we have to squeeze a lot in. So I imagine there will be a lot of questions as I go, because I can't cover everything. So please do put your questions in the chat, and we'll have some time to come to those. So as Lisa mentioned, the outcome mapping methodology has been around for 20 years. It was developed in the 1990s by the International Development Research Centre in Canada. They were coming out of the 1992 Rio World Summit on Sustainability. Sustainability was a real big issue. All the agencies involved in development were trying to get sustainability into everything they were doing. And IDRC needed a way of trying to build sustainability into the planning, monitoring, and evaluation of their research programs. They fund research, but it's very much applied research, research with research users, trying to promote use of research and innovation. So as Lisa mentioned, you know, the sort of conventional thinking, the primary logic of the time was the log frame. And this logic is built up like this, where you have your inputs and activities and outputs, they produce outcomes, and you achieve your impact. And as long as you're aware of your assumptions and you're managing your assumptions, then you can achieve this, this sort of linear approach to your results. The problem is that this clashes with cause and effect, which, as we know, are uncertain. We can try and do something, but we don't always know what we will achieve, particularly when we're working with people and organizations. They tend not to behave in ways that we can predict. So there's a lot of uncertainty and complexity. What does this mean? Well, if you think about change, change is complex. It involves different people, different organizations, different factors and perspectives, all sort of converging, and sometimes clashing, sometimes having to negotiate, sometimes having to come to agreement. It's unpredictable. Change doesn't happen in a time frame that we can predict. We have these projects that are 3 years, 5 years, but change processes have been happening long before our project, and they'll continue long after our project. Change is non-linear. We can put so much effort in, but it's not the same amount of change that comes out. Sometimes it's a lot more than we expect. Sometimes it's a lot less than we expect. So change is non-linear. Change is also two-way. So as an intervention seeks to change the environment, change people, they're also changed. The intervention changes over time. And lastly, change is beyond control. We can't control other people, other organizations, other entities. We can only influence. And that influence is really important, though. And we'll look a bit more. It's a kind of core of outcome mapping, is understanding that influence. So our nice little progression that we looked at a minute ago now looks a lot different when we take into account complexity and uncertainty. Things won't happen as we expect. Some things we try will not work. Some things we try will work a lot better than we expect. Our outcomes are going to appear here and here, you know, in unexpected places. Sometimes we won't get any change, so we get flat outcomes. There's a lot of uncertainty here. So what do we do about it? Well, usually this is a cartoon that has gone round a lot. I think it's appeared in lots of blogs and articles, but it captures quite nicely what our normal approach, which is, you know, you've got these two scientists, they've got a very clear formula at the beginning. You know, they're very clear on how they're starting, what their inputs are, their outputs, their activities. And they might know quite a lot about the other end, what they're trying to achieve, their impact, if you like. You know, they're very clear on what they care about and what change they want to see in the world. But there's this whole middle part. Some people call it the missing middle. Some people call it the black box. Here it's described as then a miracle occurs. Somehow we get from where we are to where we want to be, but we don't really know how. Outcome mapping is designed to shine a light in that middle, that missing middle, that part there. It's designed to try and work out those messy relationships that get from where we are with our activities and outputs through to the change we really want to see in the world. So what is outcome mapping then? The brief definition is that it's a participatory method for planning, monitoring, and evaluation. It's got a particular focus on change of behaviour, and not just anyone's behaviour, but the behaviour of those people or organisations that a project or programme works with. And it's got a particular orientation towards social and organisational learning to support systemic change. And Lisa mentioned these things in her introduction. And outcome mapping provides a number of starting points, if you like, a number of sort of perspectives to help us. So the first one is that it starts from observable behaviour change. Any kind of objective or goal that we have in our development projects can be broken down into what are people doing differently, how are organisations working differently. This all comes down to behaviour, and outcome mapping tries to get everything down into behaviour which you can actually see. Outcome mapping helps us to be attentive along the journey, not just focused on the goal or the end point, but to recognise that we are in a progression, that change is a continuous process, and we have to be watching as we go. Outcome mapping helps us to support people's own well-being, to help them build their own well-being, not just this paradigm of coming in with a project to sort of bring about change that we think is important, but it's about trying to understand what do those people that we're particularly concerned about, what do they think, what are they asking for, how can they manage their own well-being. Outcome mapping is trying to help us embrace different perspectives, seeing the problem or the situation from different angles, and inviting opposing perspectives into our discussion. Outcome mapping is helping us to adapt our interventions as we go, not just sticking to the plan, but recognizing that we need to change the plan. And outcome mapping helps us to apply a systems understanding, not just what's our project trying to do, what's our project focused on, but where does our project sit in the wider system, and how does it interact with the different actors in that system? What are the relationships and interrelationships in that system? So 4 key concepts in outcome mapping I'm going to walk through: sphere of influence, boundary partners, outcomes as changes in behaviour, and contribution, not attribution. So firstly, there is a limit to our influence. I talked a bit about how we can't control change at the beginning, but we can influence it. But inevitably, there's a limit. So if you imagine a project, I'll bring in some examples in a minute, but the project has its own sphere of control. Those decisions that it can make by itself, how to allocate resources, where to build partnerships. You know, it can decide certain things. The project exists for a wider reason. You know, there is a raison d'etre as to why that project is created. There's some kind of motivation, what we call here the sphere of concern. Who do you ultimately want to benefit from that project? And somewhere, I mean, we generally can't work with everyone that we want to see improved. You know, we're talking about large populations, communities. So somewhere in between these, there's a sphere of influence that determines who it is we can actually interact with, who is it we can work with. And that sphere of influence is determined by the resources we have, how much money, how much time, how many staff, maybe the geography of where we work, previous decisions that have been made about the focus of our work, the kinds of skills that we have to offer. That will all determine our sphere of influence. So the kinds of things mapping back onto this results chain, this log frame thinking, our inputs, activities, and outputs are part of our sphere of control. The outcomes are in our sphere of influence. This is how outcome mapping sees the world. And here, outcomes are all about changes in behavior. And then in our sphere of concern, we have impact, which can be, you know, the thing that drives us, the changes in well-being of people and populations, changes in state, changes in environment, changes in society. So to pick up on an example, Wellgrounded, one of the organizers of this conference, I was lucky enough to do some work with Wellgrounded last year and got to see some of their work in the Congo Basin. And they've allowed me to use their example here. So Wellgrounded are an organization that provides capacity building support. Why do they do this? Well, their sphere of concern is around people who live in forests and the environment of forests, particularly in the Congo Basin. But they don't work directly with a lot of forest communities. They work with some, but not with a very small number. So how do they then reach the people that they're trying to benefit? Through other organizations, their clients. Who are their clients? Their clients are community-based organizations and NGOs in countries in the Congo Basin. And they're trying to support their clients' behavior, capacity, and relationships. So in a bit more detail, you have their Congo Basin project. They're trying to ultimately care about people living in forests and the environments they live in. Who are the people around those people in forests that are influencing them? Well, you have various policy bodies. The Senate Committee on Environment is going through creating a law. It'd be interesting. I wonder if they've completed that task yet. But they're generating a new law for the forests that's going to affect the people living there. The EU have a big program that's all about legal timber, and that's affecting the people living in forests. And then there are CSOs, civil society organizations and community-based organizations that are targeting those people, trying to improve their well-being, their economic rights. And that's who Wellgrounded work with. So this second concept I'm introducing is boundary partner. The boundary partners are the organizations, the people that Wellgrounded work with directly. So here it's the civil society organization networks. And why does Wellgrounded work with them? Well, because of their relationships with other organizations. They are influencing the Senate Committee on Environment. They are influencing the EU program. And they're also working with some of these organizations these communities in the forests directly. So outcome mapping's idea of boundary partners takes us beyond stakeholders. It helps us to identify a bit more specifically who it is we're working with and where we want to see change and what results we can contribute to. So whereas stakeholders are very broad, it's anyone who's got an interest in or affected by our mission or vision. There are many of them. We can't work with them all. You know, we've all done these stakeholder mappings where we come up with a long list. Boundary partners tries to narrow that down. Who is it that's crucial to contributing to our shared vision? Who do we want to see change? Do we have an opportunity to work with them or otherwise influence them? This means there's few enough that we can actually monitor those over time. For Wellgrounded, that means they choose to work with civil society organizations and coalitions. They work with individual civil society leaders. They run a lot of leadership programs. They work with some forest-dependent communities and forest-related businesses. Those are their boundary partners. It's a bit more of a manageable list. And of course, boundary partners have boundary partners, and that's an important thing to remember, that often the change we want to see in our boundary partners is about how they relate to their boundary partners. So the third thing is outcomes as changes in behavior. This has come up quite a few times. All these things you see on the slide here, greater awareness, community ownership, gender sensitivity, active participation, strengthened capacity. These are things that we often read in our proposals, in our log frames, in our results frameworks, and in our reports. And they are all laudable things. You know, they're definitely things that we want to see more of in the world. The problem is, though, that they're not things you can see. You couldn't go into a room of an organization you're working with and see strengthened capacity. It's not that clear what that looks like. You have to get a bit more specific before you can start to know if that's happening, if there is budget transparency, if there is equal access, like what does that look like? So in outcome mapping, we try to avoid this language. And what we want to get to is the level of behavior change. What are people doing differently? What would you see people doing? And so the equivalent of an indicator in outcome mapping is called a progress marker. And that's a description of behavior that is telling you that a boundary partner is progressing along a journey of change. So progress markers are how we measure changes in behavior. There's a few examples from Wellgrounded. Wellgrounded expects to see, so this is the first level of progress marker, it expects to see forest-dependent communities meeting regularly. I won't describe everything, but that's the essence, is that they're meeting regularly. The second level is that Wellgrounded would like to see forest-dependent communities organizing themselves. So you can see there, we're getting a little bit more proactive. Right? It's about this boundary partner is now doing something differently working differently, behaving differently. The third level is love to see. Wellgrounded would love to see forest-dependent communities holding their CSO partners to account and saying no. And this, in Wellgrounded's analysis, would be, very sort of high-level change, quite, revolutionary in a way, because it's about power. It's about addressing a power imbalance between CSOs and forest-dependent communities. And that for them is something that they would love to see, not something that's easy to achieve. And maybe they wouldn't even see it in the life of their project. I'll move on. So the fourth and last key concept is contribution, not attribution. It's a nice little cartoon here. Gandhi's working on his spinning and receives a letter. Dear Mr. Gandhi, we regret to inform you that we are rejecting your grant application. The contribution of spinning cloth to the fall of the British Empire is not clear to us. So you can see here, if we try to put the paradigm of attribution on everything we do, we're not going to get anywhere. So in outcome mapping, we talk about the change that we contribute to. We don't achieve outcomes, we contribute to outcomes. We're usually just one contributor among many other contributors. And I just want to leave you with an idea of what outcome mapping looks like in practice. So there are these 12 steps. This is how it's presented in the original manual. The manual was written in 2001. So we're coming up to 20 years since this manual was written. Outcome mapping has adapted and evolved a lot since then. People take the manual and they turn it into something that's useful for them. If you ask Wellgrounded, did they follow all these steps as they are presented here? They would say, yeah, mostly, but no, we adapted quite a lot of it and made it our own. So the steps here are not like the 12-step program that you have to follow each one in order to be certified outcome mapping. That's not the idea. There are a set of tools. You're free to use them. You're free to bring in tools that you already use. There's a lot in outcome mapping that is kind of behind practice now. There's a lot of like stakeholder analysis and power analysis and gender analysis that I think in the last 20 years has become a lot more prevalent and advanced. So you would begin to use those and bring those in. But the key here is the intentional design. This is where the magic is, if you like, in outcome mapping, the real difference. The intentional design is a way of building a theory of change that's focused on people, organizations, and behavior change. And it puts the focus on where you're influencing, your sphere of influence. It puts your focus on who it is you're influencing and how you want to see them change. So this is my last slide. The 7 steps of the intentional design. So what is the intervention concerned about? That's your vision. What does the intervention consist of? That's your mission. What would success look like? So who is doing what differently? That's your boundary partners. And then what's going to indicate progress along this journey? That's your progress markers. And what strategies are going to support change? So what will you do to support your boundary partners? That's the strategy map. And then, of course, you've got to consider yourself. How are you going to stay viable and relevant and competent in your support to your boundary partners? How are you going to make sure you continue to change as well? That's your organizational practices. So that's just a sort of taster on what the steps of outcome mapping look like. But the core, as I say, boundary partners and progress markers. That's really where the innovation in outcome mapping is. So I'll just leave you with this. We have the outcome mapping learning community. There's a lot of resources there. There's a discussion forum. You're very welcome to join. So please go and visit. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this introduction, Simon. I would like to ask, we have prepared a little sondage, a little survey. So I would like to hear from you what you had to do so far, how you had to do with the outcome mapping and what you're planning to do with it. Marcian, may I ask you to launch the sondage, please? We have about half of you. Everyone, please answer the question you've seen, you see on your screen. Very nice, they're coming in. So, anyone else? We have almost everyone. And we see that most of you have only heard or read a little about outcome mapping, and almost 40% have never heard of outcome mapping before this conference. And then there's one expert who has read the outcome mapping manual, and 5 of you have actually attended outcome mapping training. Very interesting. And also, if you have never heard of outcome mapping, please do ask your questions in the chat. You see that a lot of other people will also probably be full of questions at this moment. So do ask questions, also the very basic ones, please. And Marcian, would you launch the second sondage, please? Answers are coming in. Anyone else wants to answer the question? How are you using outcome mapping? Then I'm going to close the poll. And you can see that more than half of you haven't used outcome mapping and you don't know yet if you will use it in the future. A quarter of you intends to use outcome mapping in the future. And 6 of the participants are continuously using outcome mappings. And 3 of you have used it in previous work. Thank you very much. So we have a bit the picture of who is in the room, in this virtual room. Then let's move on to the questions. And I have Antonia and Indira asking about the challenges, the obstacles. I don't know if you've seen the question, Simon. Antonia is asking, could you elaborate on some of the obstacles that may exist in circumstances in which it is challenging to adopt outcome mapping as a methodology? And Indira is asking what the key challenges in introducing the process. And Mireille is asking, how is outcome mapping different from classic M&E? And Antonia is asking about the time. How much time would you need to invest in an outcome mapping process on average?
Okay, let me tackle some of those. So I'll say, how is it different first? How is it different from classic M&E? Well, it kind of depends what you mean by classic M&E, but if you mean results-based management, log frames, indicators, then it is a bit different. It's different because it's, I would say, rigorously actor focused. So any kind of outcome statement, any indicator, you have to be clear who it is you're talking about. And I've seen so many log frames where they have these broad statements and you're not quite sure, well, who's actually responsible for that? Like who's involved in that happening? And it's not very clear, which could just be because it's a bad log frame. But in outcome mapping, you're always asking yourself that question, who? And secondly, it's very much focused on the system rather than the project. So it's not about, the log frame is great for risk management. It's great for managers to know what is a project trying to achieve and how do we know it's getting there. Whereas outcome mapping is more oriented towards what change do we want to see in the world, and who is it that is important for sustaining that change. And then only once you've investigated that, can you ask, and then how can we as an organization, as a project, contribute? Where can we add value? That's, I think, the key differences for outcome mapping. Challenges. So there's a couple of things here, because outcome mapping is, I guess it's quite a detailed methodology. As soon as you start asking who, as I've been saying, you have to start investigating quite closely, like, how do things work? How do things in your current system work? And you may find that a conventional approach is fine, and you don't need to go into this level of detail. But outcome mapping is particularly useful when there is uncertainty, when you don't always know the answers, when you need to tread very carefully and put a lot of attention on learning, when you're trying new things, innovating, or when you're developing new relationships. This is the time when you need to invest in learning. So it's almost, however you do it, it's going to be intensive. So outcome mapping can feel intensive, but that's because you're choosing to invest in learning. Then a challenge is that it's a different mindset, it's a different way of thinking. We're so used to just counting outputs and being clear on how many events, how many reports, how many products are we developing. You know, we're counting these, and that's what we've been told that people want to know. In outcome mapping, the focus is on what change are we contributing to. So that's a mindset change. So if you're working with colleagues, with partners who don't have that mindset, it can actually be it's a change process in itself to get them to begin to think like that. And it can take years of working with an organization to get them out of this habit that a lot of donors have encouraged of just counting the outputs. So that's, I think, is one of the challenges of this, is that it can be very difficult to achieve that change and takes time. And thirdly, if you don't have the right support, so if a donor doesn't really understand or isn't really on board with this, then that can really make it difficult for you to implement outcome mapping. Or if you're if the person who's responsible for the project or organization is not fully on board, it's going to be difficult to implement. So there's this idea of bringing along those that have responsibility to make sure that you can implement outcome mapping. Did I miss any of those questions, Lisa?
No, I think you covered it all, and we also have many additional questions, and they are at times a bit overlapping. So I think let's move on to the next three, because we have many more interesting questions. Mm-hmm. For example, Arnaud asks, what is the purpose of outcome mapping?
Good, thank you. Do you want to grab a few more?
Yeah, I'll and Amandine asks if the evaluation if that also part of outcome mapping. Laura would like you to deepen the question on the donors, since donors are used to asking for log frames. So how do they respond to outcome mapping? And Mohammed would like to know if specific training is needed for an organization inexperienced in outcome mapping, or if you could do that in a kind of self-paced learning, if you can learn it by yourself.
Okay, yeah, I'll take those. So what's the purpose of outcome mapping? The purpose is to help an organization or a project to focus on the change that they want to see in the world, to focus on their raison d'etre, as that phrase you have in French that captures so nicely. Why are you here? So that's really the purpose of outcome mapping, is to help you focus on that by shining a spotlight on your sphere of influence. How do donors respond to this? It really depends. There are many donors that have supported programs using outcome mapping. There's yeah, there's a lot of examples out there. I'd say most of the main international development donors have supported projects that have used outcome mapping. But as you know, it varies very much from person to person that you're working with in those organizations and from department to department. So there's no universals. And in fact, it was one thing that I think is a strength of outcome mapping is that IDRC, the organization that created it, they never mandated it. They never said to their grantees, this is our approach, you have to use this. They offered it, and where there was interest, they provided support, but they never mandated it. And I think that has helped it to grow, to be driven by the organization themselves, not by donor requirements. And in fact, it has been used in places where people have required it to be used, and it's not that successful because people don't buy into it. They don't feel like they are owning it. Evaluation. So is it used in evaluation? Short answer is yes. There are cases, probably not very many, but there are cases of outcome mapping being used in evaluations. It's most helpful in, if you've ever done an evaluation, you'll know that quite often you come to evaluate a program and there's no theory of change, or there's no logic as to why people did things in a particular way. So outcome mapping is very useful in that situation because it helps you to construct that theory of change, particularly if you want to know about who is changing and what did the program do to contribute to that. Outcome mapping, as I mentioned, in the 20 years it's been around, has evolved a lot. People have taken it in different directions. One of the directions it's been taken is into an approach called outcome harvesting, which you might have heard of. And this approach is all about evaluation. And so if you want to know a bit more about that, I encourage you to go there. There is a website called outcomeharvesting.net. The question about training, does an organization need training if it wants to implement outcome mapping? Generally, yes, but that's not universal. You can do it, people have done it just by teaching themselves through reading the manual, through talking with other people that have used it, through reading on examples that have been posted on the internet. So you can teach yourself and go for it, and lots of people have done that. I think it does help, and some of the cases show that it helps if there's like an experienced user coming alongside and offering coaching or mentoring. And certainly attending a training helps you get a sort of head start. But even a training by itself is not usually enough to get you going. You know, you have to put in a lot of work, particularly if it's new in your organization, you're the one who's learned about it. Then you have to do a lot of sort of championing in your own organization, like any kind of change or new approach. I think I answered those 4, Lisa.
Thank you. Yeah, we have more interesting questions. Daniela is asking, how do you involve boundary partners in the design and planning steps? And Samantha is asking, how do you make donors shift? So if there is a reluctance to embrace outcome mapping, how do you have any advice on how to deal with that? And yeah, and actually there's another question by Antonia which goes into the same, how to combine outcome mapping elements with requirements from donors that are very set on classical log frame approaches. And then Danny and Kibelo ask, what is the advantage of outcome mapping? And Kibelo also with a specific question on in what moment do you use this tool?
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you for these questions. These are
good. And this
questions.
is, I think this is probably our last round of questions. Maybe one or we may have time for another one or two after that. Okay. But thank you, Simon, for answering these.
Yeah. Great. Well, do you involve boundary partners in these steps? And the answer is, if you follow the outcome mapping manual, then yes, it's a participatory approach. It's built on a lot of these sort of participatory methods and principles that a lot of our approaches that we use are based on. I say we as a community. I'm sure you use a lot of participatory approaches as well. So yes, it's about involving your boundary partners in that. So when you're developing progress markers, like I showed you those examples from Wellgrounded, the sort of the idea, the principle is that you're doing that with your boundary partner. You're not just going in to a conversation with them saying, this is how we want you to change. Can you go off and do this, please? It's not a contract. It's not like, you know, we're hiring you. This is how we expect you to behave. Go away and do that. It's very much collaboration. And in fact, right from the vision step, the vision is intended to be a shared vision. It's not a project's own vision. Many of your projects will have their own vision, but in outcome mapping, it's encouraged that you sort of step back from your own vision and invite your boundary partners to contribute to a shared vision. And then it's much more of a joint effort. But there are situations where outcome mapping is used where the situation isn't like that. So if you're trying to influence policy and your boundary partners are government officials, you're not gonna, well, in every case, in some cases you might, but you wouldn't have a very close partnership with them, and you wouldn't necessarily invite them into a workshop and sit down and have a shared vision and develop progress markers together. I don't think they'd take very kindly to, you know, seeing how you want to see them change. So in some cases, it can be an approach that you use for yourself, your own understanding of your boundary partner, and that's okay. But where possible, you're involving your boundary partner in those conversations. When is outcome mapping best used? That is a tricky one, because the easy answer is to say right at the beginning, as early as possible, you want to use it, because that's when you have the opportunity to inform how the project is designed, how it evolves, and also inform what it's going to monitor. But often right at the beginning, your ideas are still emerging. Maybe you're still doing your preliminary work, your situation analysis. So at that stage, you need to carry on with that. You need to make sure your understanding of the situation is clear. Your understanding of the system, the actors, is clear, because it may not be apparent who your boundary partners are. So you might want to get to a certain point where you can identify the boundary partners, bring them in, and then start doing the outcome mapping with them. But I've come in, well, usually people come to me halfway through, or like towards the, like once they've gone into the project a little bit, and then they're like, oh yeah, we need to do this. And you can do that, it's fine. But in some cases, you've lost a bit of opportunity. Can you combine methods? Can you combine outcome mapping with other methods? Absolutely. There's lots of examples of people using outcome mapping inside log frames, or to sort of alongside. So sometimes inside a log frame, so you can actually, instead of indicators, you can use progress markers. but also alongside. So you can have your log frame, which is a requirement, you have to do it. It's actually maybe quite useful at some level for managing the project. But for the really nitty-gritty, understanding change, understanding how you're contributing and influencing change, you then have your outcome mapping framework. And there are ways of combining and interacting and making sure they talk to each other. How do you make donors shift? That's a really good question. I think some of you will probably have more experience on that than me. And maybe this is actually a case where you could use outcome mapping to think about how to get donors to change. If you like, think about what would you expect to see, what would you like to see, what would you love to see change. Yeah, and it's a case of the same old, one of the founders of outcome mapping, Terry Smatillo, he often says, donors ask for junk food, which is like the raw numbers. They want to know how many people have been served, how many lives saved, how many bums on seats in schools. Those are the numbers that get the donors going. But that's junk food, and you know that that's not the interesting stuff. You know that that's just the sort of tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding what's going on. So you feed them healthy food as well at the same time. You give them the stories. I think someone mentioned that in the chat. Yeah, Mireille, you mentioned that. Donors do like stories, and outcome mapping provides stories. It's the real essence about change and how it happens. So you give them a bit of that as well. And if they're interested in change and how change happens, then they'll appreciate that, and it'll encourage them to come back and find out more.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have a very urgent last question? Joe, we realized that you had your hand up. Has this question been addressed?
It's Joe Cole. He had his hand raised for a long time, but I'm not sure if the question has been answered or not. Joe? Okay.
Oui, allô?
Oui, vas-y.
Allô?
Vas-y. Oui, on vous écoute. Allez-y. On vous écoute.
Allô?
Joe, on a que 1 minute.
Est-ce que vous
Vous avez
m'entendez?
une question?
On vous écoute, Joe. On vous écoute. Allez-y.
Je n'ai pas le retour.
Okay. Okay. Well.
I think that is difficult, but I think we have had a very, very rich overview and answers to many questions. So thank you, Simon, very much for these insights. And of course, such a session is far, far too short to address all the questions, and in particular, the practical side of things. So we have to close. Our hour is up, and we know that there will be another session in half an hour with Tarek Al-Saleh. So please sign up if you're interested in that. And then tomorrow we have a full day ahead on learning and support in the digital age. So please come back for more if you like this session, and do say so on social media if you liked it. And what remains for me is really just to thank you, to thank you, the active participants who really made a big contribution to making this this session a success. and in particular, of course, Simon Hearn, who presented, and Guillaume, Mireille, and Marcian, who did the technical support so that everything worked out properly. And yeah, keep following and keep active. And
thank you, Philippe, for all your translation.
And, oh my God, of course. And thank you, Philippe. This has been a very, very stressful, because it has been so much content. So thank you very much for your effort. It was very good. I listen in on both languages. And so thank you very much for being here with us, Philippe.
Thank you, Lisa, for animation, and see you in 15 minutes or half an hour. No,
half an hour. Yes.
In half an hour.
For today's last session, if you signed up for it, if you want to hear Tarek.
Thank you. Merci à tous. À très bientôt.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thanks, Simon.
Bye bye.
La conversation, et je vais couper pour tout le monde.
Ciao.